In war, some missions are measured by territory taken, others by enemies defeated. And then there are missions remembered for something far rarer, what men were willing to risk for one life. During the Vietnam War, an American aircraft was shot down over hostile territory, leaving Lieutenant Colonel Iceal Hambleton stranded deep behind enemy lines, surrounded by North Vietnamese forces. Under ordinary logic, he should have been written off as unrecoverable. Instead, the United States launched one of the most astonishing and costly rescue efforts in military history, committing enormous resources, risking aircraft, losing men, and escalating a mission so dangerous many believed it should never have continued, all for one man. But Bat 21 was never simply a rescue. It became a taste of survival, of military resolve, and of how far a nation would go to keep a promise to one of its own, because bringing Hambleton home would cost far more than anyone expected, and at times it looked impossible. This is the true story of Bat 21, the rescue mission that risked hundreds for one man. It was April 1972, during one of the most intense phases of the Vietnam War. Lieutenant Colonel Iceal Hambleton was aboard an EB-66 electronic warfare aircraft, flying a mission over enemy territory during the Easter Offensive, a period when North Vietnamese forces were pushing hard and the battle space had become extraordinarily dangerous. Then disaster struck. Surface-to-air missiles found the aircraft. The jet was hit. Crew members were forced to eject, and in moments, Hambleton descended by parachute into one of the worst places an American officer could land. This was not merely enemy territory. This was territory saturated with hostile troops, thousands of them. And Hambleton was no ordinary downed airman. He carried sensitive strategic knowledge, including classified information that made his capture a national-level concern. Suddenly, this was no longer just a rescue mission. This had become urgent at the highest levels, because leaving him behind was not considered acceptable. But first, he had to survive. And survival seemed unlikely. He was older than most combat air crew, not trained like a ground survival specialist, and now alone in hostile terrain, with enemy forces searching. Yet what happened next remains one of the most remarkable survival stories in American military history. One of the strangest and most extraordinary details in this story sounds almost fictional. It wasn't. Hambleton was an avid golfer, and his knowledge of golf course distances, angles, yardage, directional judgment would help keep him alive. American controllers guiding him by radio used those instincts to help him move and evade. Imagine that, an officer alone behind enemy lines, surviving partly through instincts sharpened by golf. That detail alone feels impossible. But Bat 21 is full of things that feel impossible. As enemy forces searched for him, Hambleton hid, moved cautiously, followed instructions from rescuers, and tried to stay ahead of patrols hunting him. And the danger around him kept growing, because every hour he remained alive increased pressure to bring him out. And every rescue attempt would bring more risk, much more. At first, conventional rescue attempts were launched. Aircraft searched, extraction efforts were considered. But almost immediately, the mission encountered brutal resistance. Enemy anti-air defenses were intense. The environment was punishing, and attempts to reach Hambleton began costing lives. That is what made Bat 21 extraordinary. This was not one rescue attempt, it became repeated attempts, escalating attempts. and each new effort seemed to increase the stakes. Aircraft were lost, airmen were killed, more personnel became endangered. At some point, the obvious question emerged: how much should be risked for one man? That question still echoes around this mission, because the answer in practice was astonishing, a great deal, and they kept going, even when many believed they shouldn't. As the days passed, Bat-21 became less a standard recovery and more an ordeal consuming attention, resources, and human lives. Hambleton remained alive, evading enemy forces while rescuers struggled to reach him. Meanwhile, American forces adapted, plans changed, approaches shifted, and eventually the mission began relying not only on air power, but on something even riskier: ground recovery. That meant placing more Americans in danger. But by this point, the mission had taken on a force of its own. It was no longer just about extracting one isolated officer. It had become about whether the rescue promise would hold. And in military culture, that matters, because promises like that carry weight. They shape morale, they shape trust, and sometimes they shape history. But before rescue could come, Hambleton still had to survive one more impossible stretch. And enemy forces were tightening around him. Every great rescue story has a moment where the impossible begins to turn. In Bat-21, that moment came through one man, Lieutenant Thomas Norris. What Norris did has become legend. Rather than rely solely on conventional extraction, he undertook a near unthinkable effort to reach Hambleton through hostile territory. This was the kind of mission where everything could go wrong. One mistake meant death, capture, failure. Yet Norris kept moving toward danger, toward a man many believed unreachable. And after enormous risk, he found him. Think about what that means. A rescue mission that had consumed aircraft, lives, and national attention, ultimately narrowing down to one man walking into hell to bring another out. That is not ordinary warfare. That is something closer to myth. But it happened, and getting Hambleton out still wasn't simple, because surviving contact is one thing, escaping is another. The final escape demanded extraordinary nerve. Enemy forces remained everywhere. Exposure meant death. Movement had to be careful, timing precise, and the margin for error nearly non-existent. But somehow, after one of the most prolonged and dangerous rescue efforts of the war, Hambleton made it out, alive, after odds many considered impossible, and only afterward did the true scale of what had happened begin settling in. Aircraft lost, lives risked, lives lost. Resources committed on a scale almost unimaginable for one isolated man, which is why Bat-21 still raises a haunting question. Was it worth it? Inside much of the rescue community, the answer remains yes, because they do not judge missions like this by efficiency. They judge them by whether a promise was kept, and somehow, despite everything, this one was. Most people hear Bat-21 and think it is a war story. It is. But it is also something deeper, a story about obligation, about refusing abandonment, about what people will risk for one human being. And that is why it still resonates. Not simply because it was dramatic, because it forces a moral question. How far should a nation go to save one of its own? Bat-21 answered in extraordinary fashion, farther than most people would imagine. And perhaps that is why this story never faded, because it contains something timeless: courage, duty, and the astonishing lengths people sometimes go for each other. Lieutenant Colonel Iceal Hambleton should have disappeared into enemy territory as another casualty of war. Instead, his survival triggered one of the most remarkable rescue operations ever attempted, a mission so dangerous it consumed aircraft, cost lives, and forced America to answer what one man was worth. Bat 21 became more than a rescue. It became a legend, because at its core, it tells a story people instinctively respond to. That even in war, where logic often turns brutal, some promises remain stronger than calculation, and sometimes entire operations are built around keeping one of those promises. That is why Bat 21 is still remembered, not merely as survival, but as one of the greatest rescue stories ever told. But as extraordinary as Bat 21 was, there was another rescue where modern air power launched an armada of more than 100 aircraft to bring one pilot home. And some believed the mission would fail. That story may be even more unbelievable. Stay locked in.